Very often communication is successful, also in cross-cultural contexts. However, sometimes problems or misunderstandings may occur because speakers may perceive or interpret things in a different way, or because of different cultural values that may be reflected in language. This short presentation deals with some of the areas of language use which might be difficult for learners when they learn a new language. Intercultural communicative competence has been seen as the main objective of foreign language learning, especially since the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages was published by the Council of Europe in 2001. The document states that the concept of ICC means that learners can act in a linguistically, sociolinguistically, and pragmatically appropriate way. In other words, apart from the necessary language skills, two additional competences are crucial for language learners: sociolinguistic competence and pragmatic competence. Let's take a closer look at all three competences mentioned in the document. The first component of intercultural communicative competence is linguistic competence, which would traditionally include more specific competences such as lexical competence, grammatical competence, semantic competence, phonological competence, and orthographic competence. All of these competences are, of course, necessary requirements to understand and produce language. Sociolinguistics is mainly concerned with the study of social and regional variation in languages. Therefore, developing sociolinguistic competence in a second language means, for example, that learners know how to address people appropriately and that they can actively use specific politeness routines, or that they can distinguish between different registers. In formal situations, for example, a different register might be needed compared to the register needed in an informal situation. It would also mean that learners are not only familiar with the standard language, but also, to a certain extent at least, with the various major dialects and accents in the target language. The third competence, pragmatic competence, is based on the linguistic discipline of pragmatics, which is concerned with the study of language use, in particular with the question how meaning is conveyed in interactions. This would therefore also include discourse and functional competence. Pragmatic competence is an aspect which has been neglected for a long time in foreign language teaching. However, this competence is of great importance in cross-cultural communication. Take a look at the following example. A German exchange student was once asked by a friend of his American host family, "How do you like the US?" He then started to list all the things he liked about the US and all the things he disliked. He quickly noticed from the reaction he got that he had done something wrong. What had happened here was a so-called sociopragmatic failure, because the German exchange student had misinterpreted this question. In Germany, such a question might be interpreted as a sincere question, which gives you the opportunity to state everything, whether it's positive or negative, that comes to your mind. Apparently, he didn't know that the expectation in this case was to list only the positive aspects. The problem was that he was not familiar with cultural values and beliefs underlying the question. So quite often the problem is not really a linguistic one. The meaning of the individual words might be well known, the pronunciation might be clear, there might also be no grammatical problems. The real problem is to interpret the speaker meaning. What do speakers really mean when they say something? When we communicate, there's usually a great deal of invisible meaning, and the challenge for learners is how do they recognize what is meant, even if it isn't actually said or written? One of the main challenges for language learners is to interpret the speaker's meaning appropriately. In other words, they have to bridge the gap between what is said and what is heard. What is the speaker's meaning in the phrase, "I'll give you a call"? Is this really a promise, or is it just a common politeness routine, which simply means, "You seem to be a really nice person, and I wouldn't mind meeting you again sometime, someplace"? If you interpret this phrase as a promise, it might lead to disappointment or even to the fact that you might think the other person is insincere or superficial. In general, transfer from the first language to the second language is a very common phenomenon in language acquisition. Learners often transfer words or syntactic structures from their mother tongue to the second language, or pronounce words based on the phonological rules in their first language. What is sometimes neglected is that also pragmatic transfer may occur. For example, the transfer of politeness routines or transfer of the ways how particular speech acts are performed. Problems often occur when learners rely too much on the pragmatic norms of their first language. For example, when they perform specific speech acts such as requesting, ordering, complaining, or criticizing. Secondly, learners may believe that pragmatic norms are universal, when in fact they are often tied to a specific culture. There are various hotspots or critical incidents in cross-cultural communication which might be difficult to manage for learners who are not yet familiar with the invisible speaker meaning in each case. How do you say hello or goodbye? How do you say yes or no? How do you make offers? How do you ask somebody to do something for you? What are appropriate ways of apologizing? When do people say excuse me or I'm sorry? At first glance, one may believe that many of these speech situations seem to be performed in almost the same way everywhere in the world. But even in cultures which seem relatively close to one another, problems may occur in these areas. What can be difficult sometimes is to interpret the speaker's intention correctly. Here are a few simple examples. How do you offer someone a seat, for example? In English, you may use a very polite question, would you like to sit? Or a polite offer, please have a seat. However, in German or in many Slavic languages, for example in Polish, it is quite common to use imperatives if you offer someone a chair. Bitte setzen Sie sich. Please sit, sit, with a falling intonation. Imperatives are normally used to give orders. That's why such phrases might easily be interpreted as a command rather than an offer. The function is basically the same, but cultures have just chosen different politeness conventions in this case. Making a request can also be a difficult speech act for learners, since you want somebody to do something for you. The person who wants to make a request always has several options. For example, if you want somebody to close the window, you may choose a rather indirect approach by using hints. For example, it's a bit cold in here. Or you may ask a polite question, focusing on the other person's willingness to help you by asking, would you mind closing the window? A more direct approach is found when you focus on your own needs and wishes, for example, by saying, I'm freezing. And the most direct approach is to use imperatives. Please close the window. Which form is chosen depends on a lot of factors, of course, the situation or the relationship between the two speakers, but quite often also on cultural conventions. There are some cultures which prefer rather direct approaches, while others prefer rather indirect approaches. However, if learners transfer their pragmatic conventions to the second language, the following problems may occur. Using a direct approach, for example an imperative, may sound rude to someone who is rather used to indirect approaches, while using a very indirect approach, for example a hint, may not necessarily have the desired effect on the listener, who simply may not interpret the request correctly. In general, some cultures may prefer rather direct and explicit approaches and focus more on the content, while other cultures prefer more indirect and implicit approaches because they focus very much on how the relationship might be affected by the communicative behavior. In fact, this is a continuum, of course, and a lot depends on the situation and the weight of imposition when you ask someone for a favor. Criticism can also be formulated either in a very direct or in a rather indirect way. Since criticizing is a potentially face-threatening act, many cultures prefer rather indirect ways of criticizing others. I only have a few minor comments. Again, a problem may occur when pragmatic values and conventions are simply transferred from the first to the second language. There may even be differences with respect to making compliments. In American English, if someone pays you a compliment, it can be quite appropriate to simply accept the compliment and say, thanks. In other cultures, for example in Germany, people may react in a different way and say something like, oh, but it was really cheap. That doesn't mean that people aren't happy about the compliment. They just don't want to show how pleased they are and rather wish to appear modest and therefore downplay the compliment a little bit. Finally, the role of small talk in cultures can be quite different as well. Talking about the weather, for example, is a very common practice in many countries, as in this example. Nice day, isn't it? Yes, it's certainly much warmer than yesterday. Such interaction may sound very trivial for some cultures where small talk plays only a minor role in conversation. But again, there's some invisible meaning here. As Kate Fox once observed, a question like, nice day, isn't it, isn't really a question about the weather. It has rather an important social function. It may simply serve as an introduction or as an icebreaker leading to conversation on other matters. It may simply have the same function as a greeting, or it may fill an awkward pause. The main idea in all cases is social bonding. That's why it's also very important not to contradict anyone when discussing the weather, of course. So when we consider all these pragmatic differences, what are the main conclusions concerning the development of socio-pragmatic competence? First of all, we have to keep in mind that language learning is more than just the acquisition of vocabulary and grammar. There's a great deal of invisible meaning which is conveyed in interactions, even in some very basic speech situations. Second, pragmatic meaning is not universal but rather culture-specific. Cultures have developed their own specific norms and conventions based on what they assume to be appropriate pragmatic behavior. Third, communication problems may arise when learners are not aware of differences in cross-cultural communication. Quite often, in fact, such mistakes have much more impact on the listener or reader than any lexical or grammatical mistake. And fourth, there is a great need to integrate the pragmatic dimension into foreign language teaching, since in the past the focus has been mainly on the promotion of language skills only. The development of pragmatic competence could be promoted by applying a four-step model. The first step would be to select and explore pragmatically critical areas in interactions, such as making requests, apologizing, criticizing, and so on. In a second step, learners are made aware of ambiguity and potential misunderstandings by analyzing the invisible meaning and by comparing critical incidents with one's own culture. The third step would be to show learners which linguistic forms and patterns are used in the target language during the performance of such speech acts. Finally, the idea is to make learners accept the other culture's communicative priorities as equally valid. For example, politeness can be expressed in very different ways, or there may be different degrees of directness or explicitness. But learners need to realize that this is not a matter of right or wrong or better or worse, but that there are just different behaviors. All in all, developing pragmatic competence would help learners to bridge the gap between what is said and what is meant, and it would help them to put all the linguistic pieces of information together.